A little more, and Jean Rousseau would have been a giant. Brittany men are small, as a rule, but Jean was an exception. He was a powerful young fellow who, up to the time he was compelled to enter the army, had spent his life in dragging heavy nets over the sides of a boat. He knew the Brittany coast, rugged and indented as it is, as well as he knew the road from the little cafe on the square to the dwelling of his father on a hillside overlooking the sea. Men who mix with mountains become as rough and rugged as the rocks, and the Alpine corpse was a wild body, harsh and brutal. Punishment in the ranks was swift and terrible, for the corpse was situated far away from any of the civilizing things of modern life, and deeds were done which the world knew not of, deeds which would not have been approved if reported at headquarters. The regiment of which Jean became a unit was stationed in a high valley that had but one outlet, a well passed down. The regiment of the Alpine Corps, stationed in a high valley that had just one outlet, a wild pass down which a mountain river roared and foamed and tossed. The narrow path by the side of the stream was the only way out of or into the valley, for all around the little plateau was walled in by immense peaks of everlasting snow, dazzling in the sunlight and luminous even in the still, dark nights. From the peaks to the south, Italy might have been seen, but no man had ever dared to climb any of them. The angry little river was fed from a glacier whose blue breast lay sparkling in the sunshine to the south, and the stream circumnavigated the enclosed plateau as if trying to find an outlet for its tossing waters. Jean was terribly lonely in these dreary and unaccustomed solitudes. The white mountains awed him, and the mad roar of the river seemed but poor compensation for the dignified, measured thunder of the waves on the broad sands of the Brittany coast. But John was a good-natured giant, and he strove to do whatever was required of him. He was not quick at repartee, and the men mocked his Breton dialect. He became the butt for all their small and often mean jokes. And from the first, he was very miserable. For, added to his yearning for the sea, whose steady roar he heard in his dreams at night, he felt the utter lack of all human sympathy. At first, he endeavoured by unfailing good nature and prompt obedience to win the regard of his fellows, and he became in a measure the slave of the regiment. But the more he tried to please, the more his burden increased, and the greater were the insults he was compelled to bear from both officers and men. It was so easy to bully this giant, whom they nicknamed SAMSON, that even the smallest men in the regiment felt at liberty to swear at him or cuff him if necessary. But at last, Samson's good nature seemed to be wearing out. His stock was becoming exhausted, and his comrades forgot that the Bretons for hundreds of years have been successful fighters, and that the blood of contention flows in their veins. Although the Alpine Corps, as a general thing, contain the largest and strongest men in the French army, yet the average French soldier may be termed undersized when compared with the military of either England or Germany. There were several physically small men in the regiment, and one of these, like a diminutive gnat, was Samson's worst persecutor. As there was no other man in the regiment whom the gnat could bully, Samson received more than even he could be expected to bear. One day, the gnat ordered Samson to bring him a pail of water from the stream, and the big man unhesitatingly obeyed. He spilled some of it coming up the bank, and when he delivered it to the little man, the latter abused him for not bringing the pail full. And as several of the larger soldiers, who had all in their turn made Samson miserable, were standing about, the little man picked up the pail of water and dashed it into Samson's face. It was such a good opportunity for showing off before the big men, who removed their pipes from their mouths and laughed loudly as Samson, with his knuckles, tried to take the water out of his eyes. Then Samson did an astonishing thing. "You miserable little insignificant rat," he cried. "I could crush you, but you're not worth it. But to show you that I am not afraid of any of you, there and there," he pronounced. As he said these two words with emphasis, he struck out from the shoulder, not at the little man, but at the two biggest men in the regiment, and felled them like logs to the ground. A cry of rage went up from their comrades. But bullies are cowards at heart, and while Samson glared around at them, no one made a move. The matter was reported to the officer, and Samson was placed under arrest. When the inquiry was held, the officer expressed his astonishment at the fact that Samson hit two men who had nothing to do with the insult he had received, while the real culprit had been allowed to go unpunished. "They deserved it," said Samson sullenly, "for what they had done before. I could not strike the little man. I should have killed him." "Silence," cried the officer. "You must not answer me like that." "I shall answer you as I like," said Samson doggedly. The officer sprang to his feet, and with a little rattan cane in his hand, struck the insubordinate soldier twice across the face, each time raising an angry red mark. Before the guards had time to interfere, Samson sprang upon the officer, lifted him like a child above his head, and dashed him with a sickening crash to the ground, where he lay motionless. A cry of horror went up from everyone present. "I have had enough," cried Samson, turning to go. But he was met by a bristling hedge of steel. He was like a rat in a trap. He stood defiantly there, a man maddened by oppression, and glared around helplessly. whatever might have been his punishment for striking his comrades. There was no doubt now about his fate. The guardhouse was a rude hut of logs situated on the banks of the roaring stream. Into this room Samson was flung, bound hand and foot, to await the court-martial the next day. The shattered officer, whose sword had broken in pieces under him, slowly revived and was carried to his quarters. A sentry marched up and down all night before the guardhouse. In the morning, when Samson was sent for, the guardhouse was found to be empty. The huge Breton had broken his bonds, as did Samson of old. He had pushed out a log of wood from the wall and had squeezed himself through to the bank of the stream. There all trace of him was lost. If he had fallen in, then of course he had sentenced and executed himself. But in the mud near the water were great footprints, which no boot but that of Samson could have made. So if he were in the stream, it must have been because he threw himself there. The trend of the footprints, however, indicated that he had climbed on the rocks, and there, of course, it was then impossible to trace him. The sentries who guarded the pass maintained that no one had gone through during the night. But to make sure, several men were sent down the path to overtake the runaway. Even if he reached a town or a village far below, so huge a man could not escape notice. The searchers were instructed to telegraph his description and his crime as soon as he reached a telegraph wire. It was impossible to hide in the valley, and a rapid search speedily convinced the officers that the delinquent was not there.